Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Krishna C. Nadella, and this is State of Mind. Today's topic is about affirmative action. Many colleges and universities use race as a factor in admissions, but the approach has been a hot-button issue for decades, even making its way to the Supreme Court several times since the late 1970s. Critics argue that racial preferences in college admissions hurt minority students more than they help them. Schools relaxed our academic standards to admit more minority students, they say, and underrepresented minority students who enter with lower academic credentials end up concentrated at the bottom of the most selective schools. Proponents, on the other hand, say the policies help create more diverse campuses, which better prepare all students for life after school, particularly as the United States becomes increasingly diverse. With us here today to help better understand the topic is Dr. Murali Balaji. Dr. Balaji is the Hindu American Foundation's Director of Education and Curriculum Reform. A Fulbright specialist and longtime advocate of minority issues, he has taught at multiple universities and authored several books. Dr. Balaji earned his BA from the University of Minnesota and his doctorate from Penn State University. Murali, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Krishna.
So before we get started, and as a Canadian myself, I'm not too familiar with affirmative action, although there are some select cases in Canada as well. What is affirmative action?
So affirmative action is a very broad program that was implemented in the 1960s, partially under the Civil Rights Act, essentially designed to provide more opportunities in education and in commerce for both minorities and women.
Okay.
Now, since the 1960s, a large number of the recipients of affirmative action programs, beneficiaries, I should say, of affirmative action programs, have been women, particularly white women.
Okay.
So it is not purely on racial or ethnic identity in terms of where selective factors are provided.
So before we continue, just to make sure our audience knows where you stand, what is your opinion or what is your stance on affirmative action in the academic admissions process?
I support affirmative action when it comes to enhancing the diversity of a campus. I believe a student's racial or ethnic background can provide a campus benefits beyond the bottom line. With that being said, I support affirmative action both from using race as a factor for college admissions, but also class as well. I think that it's really important for us to have a combination of means testing as well as looking at a student's diverse background.
When you say class, you mean socioeconomic class?
Socioeconomic status, absolutely.
So from an admission standpoint, what are the proper factors one should be looking at when implementing affirmative action into an application?
The factors, I mean, at the bottom line, the student of a diverse background has to have qualifications that are at least at the level of admission. So one of the common misconceptions about affirmative action is that affirmative action policies are admitting unqualified or underqualified students. When the reality is that's absolutely not the case. Affirmative action does two things. One, it simply gives students an opportunity to compete for a position. It doesn't guarantee it.
Oh, really?
So race can be a positive factor that, you know, when you have two students of perhaps equal footing and one happens to be a diverse candidate, that candidate's diversity is seen as a plus. Perhaps it can be a deciding factor, but it's not a guarantee for admission. The second thing when colleges are looking is really what the student can bring in terms of overall benefit to the campus. So it's not just academics, it's well-roundedness and how that student's background can impact the college in a positive way. So if a student is a first-generation college applicant, you know, child of immigrants, for example, or comes from a working class or poorer background, colleges look at that as a way, again, ideally, of breaking through the homogeneity of a college admission process.
Right. Okay. So some of the things I've learned in my research when I was preparing for this episode is that there are problems at times with affirmative action when it comes to the soft approach. What is the soft approach, and talk to me about your knowledge of it and why it should be something that we shouldn't be talking about so much when it comes to admissions.
So I think, broadly speaking, the soft approach is looking more on race and ethnicity and gender as variables, not just, you know, hey, these are the deciding factors, but they're variables that benefit a candidate's status. Now, critics would argue that it essentially makes one's background a bonus rather than the merits of the application. My personal opinion is, I think that a student's gender or racial ethnic background should be viewed supplementary to the student's qualifications. In other words, you're not going to see a student applying to Harvard with a 1,000 SAT and a 2.5 GPA and expect to have a chance to compete. That's not what's happening. Again, you're looking at colleges, particularly larger universities, whether they're private or public, that are simply trying to get a more diverse candidate pool. At the end of the day, those results can be mixed, but it's worth noting that at a time when our schools are becoming more segregated, our K-12 schools are becoming more segregated, college really does provide the last bastion for American students to interact with diverse cultures before going into their post-college life.
Got it. So this may sound naive and somewhat even simplistic. If the applicant, who is someone that would be considered for affirmative action, that is a lower socioeconomic status, maybe a minority background, has the proper credentials, has the right GPA, head-to-head against a Caucasian student, shouldn't just be the best person who's qualified to be able to get into the program be the one that succeeds?
Yeah, and you know, there's a major problem with that, because when you look at that from a bottom line perspective, like the numbers don't lie perspective, it really throws out the qualitative aspects of the student's life and background. So if you were to ask me, if I were the admissions director and I had two students that had the exact same application in terms of the resume, the activities done, et cetera, et cetera. Let's say one was a white person with a diploma from a upper echelon public high school in a suburban area. The other student is African American, maybe Latino, and has her or his diploma from a public school that is not in such a great area, but who has excelled despite that institutional issue. I would lean towards, I'm not saying I would decide arbitrarily, but I would lean towards that latter candidate simply because it would appear that that student has overcome more challenges. And a lot of these things also depend on the personal essay. I think the college admission process, critics of affirmative action think that, oh, just because a candidate is diverse, he has an inherent advantage. That's absolutely not the case. A lot of universities use that as a bonus rather than any sort of arbitrary deciding factor. And I think that should be really clarified, that there isn't a quota system. For example, the Supreme Court has ruled against that. And most states, especially in light of Supreme Court decisions, cannot use race as, an overt factor. I mean, you look at California, for example, that enacted Proposition 187 or 209, one of those propositions nearly 20 years ago, that essentially bars race from being a deciding factor in college admissions.
So if anything, the statement that I said about two candidates who are both on paper the same, just different backgrounds, that's not even the right question to ask, because there's so many other factors to take into consideration.
Absolutely. And I think the admissions process is really not accurately conveyed to the public, that many of these factors are counted. And I will also say that means testing is more important now, like especially if you see, for example, a first-generation college applicant from Appalachia who is more likely than not to be white,
right,
versus, let's say, an upper-middle-class Latino student who comes from a very, very good school. Believe it or not, that first-generation white college applicant may have a lot going in terms of her or his application because of the socioeconomic status.
right.
So again, we should also caution that race and gender are now just becoming factors rather than deciders when it comes to college admission.
So enlighten me, Murali. Why, and maybe I am the ignorant one in this conversation, but why does there seem to be a misinformation, or at least a misinformed understanding of affirmative action from the general sense of the public, that it is this favoritism type program that looks at certain backgrounds as a primary predicating factor that admission is based on?
So that really started in the 1980s.
Okay.
To be completely frank, it started in 1978 with the Baca versus California Board of Regents case, where the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action, but ruled against set-asides for minorities. In the 1980s, and this is where it did get politicized, the Reagan administration undermined or undid several key provisions of the Civil Rights Act. And as a result, there were more attempts at kind of going after affirmative action.
I see.
For example, there were public campaigns designed to show that affirmative action in college or even in hiring in companies was at the expense of quote-unquote hardworking Americans. In other words, it painted...
But these are all Americans.
Well, that's the thing, but the way that the language was done was that these quote-unquote unworthy others, explicitly referring to minorities, are taking jobs or taking college posts away from more qualified people. And it was racially coded language. Sometimes it was more overt. But the bottom line is the public perceptions began to change in the 1980s. So much so that by the 1990s, even under Bill Clinton, affirmative actions saw more rollback.
Really?
And so what we saw by the end of the 1990s was that initiatives that were specifically used to enhance diversity could no longer consider race and ethnicity as the sole factors in making someone eligible. So it used to be that there were scholarships explicitly set aside for minorities. Cannot do that anymore. There used to be a system where race and ethnicity factored more prominently in the decision process. However, as I said, a series of the Supreme Court rulings, both in employment and education, have really, really limited the scope of affirmative action. The 2003 Bohlinger versus University of Michigan case, again, upheld affirmative action as constitutional, but greatly limited its scope. And I believe that more constitutional challenges in the years ahead will further limit the scope from which race and ethnicity can be used as a factor for a candidate.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if I, as a private citizen, would like to donate money or endow a scholarship at a university I attended,
Yes.
and I'd like to put it towards Latino students or African American students or any sort of race-based case, I'd have a difficult time doing that?
So that's another tricky part. Public institution scholarships cannot set up those race-based or ethnicity-based scholarships. The language is a little less clear when it comes to private institutions. I think private institutions have largely gone the way of public schools in the sense that they don't explicitly mention it, but there are ways. For example, there are what we call diversity scholarships,
I see.
Which don't prohibit white applicants from applying,
Right.
but generally speaking, students from diverse backgrounds, minority backgrounds, do get preference for them.
Got it. So let me throw another monkey wrench into this. Where do Asian Americans fit into affirmative action?
It's funny because I benefited from an affirmative action program when I started at the University of Minnesota. I started in a minority Head Start freshman program that really put me, as well as my peers who were of diverse backgrounds, on an advanced footing in college. I would argue that because of that program, I was able to graduate college in 3 years in the 1990s. But ironically, after I left, by 2000, I believe, they had greatly limited that program's scope, and for almost a decade, they had discontinued the program.
Really?
What I believe for Asian Americans in affirmative action needs to be understood is that the idea of Asian Americans not needing affirmative action is largely based on this idea of the model minority. However, when you look at the socioeconomic status of many Asian Americans, just look right here in New York City, whether you go to Queens and you see the working class Chinese communities or the Indo-Caribbean communities, they do need some sort of consideration of their background when it comes to college and employment status. So affirmative action has benefited Asian Americans, although it has benefited them far less than it has benefited African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, and I would argue and white women. But Asian Americans, in some cases, still are able to get the benefit, especially if there's a means testing component to it. And I believe that Asian Americans need to be part of the conversation, in part because we only hear about the cases in which Asian Americans are overrepresented, but not enough where we see Asian Americans not being represented, particularly Asian Americans who fall outside of the quote big three of the Asian American community, being Indian, Chinese American, Japanese, and arguably Korean Americans. I would say that Southeast Asians, Caribbean and diasporic Asians, they really need that consideration.
Got it. So you kind of alluded to this earlier in the episode, but in a perfect world, if you were running a college campus and you were the director of admissions, what are the proper steps to implement an affirmative action program?
The proper steps are to ensure that diversity is among a multitude of equally weighted factors. In other words, weighting diversity over other factors, such as one's test score or one's GPA or extracurricular activities, just may not be constitutionally sound, given the recent Supreme Court decisions. But ensuring that diversity is considered an equal part of the selection process. The other thing I would do, and this really speaks more to what needs to be done at the selection level, I would make sure that the admissions counselors and the people reviewing the applications are from diverse backgrounds. This is one thing where I believe the idea of perspective and seeing the world through another's eyes is very important. I think one of the major problems with any of these diversity initiatives is that they don't address the root of the problem, whether in college or in the workplace. There need to be more hiring managers of diverse backgrounds, and or admissions counselors of diverse background. I think once you get to that point, then, to be honest, affirmative action does not become as important or as necessary.
Right.
But until we get to that point, then we're still stuck in this thing where people from underrepresented backgrounds are not getting in or getting their foot in the door.
Got it. Thank you. So, final question as we end the episode. In the perfect world, is the end goal for one day there to be no need for affirmative action programs? That is, one day they're no longer relevant because we have a diverse admissions effort across the country, a diverse perspective on the world because we're more globalized, and everyone is being given a consideration based on their background and on their merit.
I think that would be an ideal, okay? And I want to put an asterisk. That would be an ideal, but we don't know the changing demographics of this society. So there could be other marginalized groups that come into the picture 20, 30, 40 years from now. Right. Our society's landscape is rapidly changing. Right. But with that being said, I think in order to achieve that goal of meritocracy, we just need to make both our hiring and maybe college selections processes more empathetic. And I think once we develop that institutional empathy, then naturally affirmative action becomes less relevant.
All right. So affirmative action is not about any one race or any one background. It's the concept of giving a chance for equal footing.
Exactly.
For any group that's starting to develop and looking for an identity.
Exactly.
Thank you. Murali, this has been very informative. I appreciate the time today, and thank you for your perspectives.
My pleasure, Krishna. Thank you.
On that note, that'll wrap up our show for today. If you like what you saw in today's episode, please like, comment, share, and subscribe on the following social media platforms at the bottom of your screen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. And remember, every life is a book. Make yours a bestseller. Have a good night.